Good afternoon, good morning. This is the German Marshall Fund event on transatlantic relations in a time of tariffs. And we've got an outstanding panel of experts today to help us understand a very complex topic in our times of today. So let's get started. First, we've got organization and a partner in crime that we've worked with before, Sean Bray, the Vice President of Global Projects at the Tax Foundation and the Policy Director of Tax Foundation Europe. He researches international trade issues with a focus on tax policy in Europe. He's worked in both the US Senate and the European Parliament and has degrees from the College of Europe and the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Dr. Mona Paulson joined the London School of Economics in 2020 as an assistant professor for international economic law. She holds numerous impressive degrees in international law and is a registered Canadian lawyer. Mona has a paper forthcoming titled The Past, Present, and Potential of Economic Security in the Yale Journal of International Law. She's also, many of you may know Mona from a very active social presence she has on trade policy. Rupert Schlegel-Melch has a distinguished career in trade, working in the European Commission, most recently as the director for North and Latin America, and helping to push the EU-Mercosur agreement across the line. He was also the ambassador to the OECD and to UNESCO and served in many different roles in DG Trade, and he's currently a lecturer at the College of Europe teaching a class on EU trade policy. And last but not least, we have Dan Mullaney, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and the Geoeconomic Center. Most recently, Dan served as Assistant USTR for Europe and the Middle East in the Office of the United States Trade Representative from 2010 to 2023, where he got to see a lot of really interesting things along with Rupert, such as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Trade and Technology Council. Before USTR, before he was the head of the Europe office at USTR, he was also a representative here for USTR in Brussels, Belgium. He's a native of Ohio, and he is also a lawyer. So we have a panel full of lawyers or Big Ten grads. So with that, I'm going to kick it off. And Mona, I'm going to ask you to maybe start us off. So President Trump and before him, President Biden, have argued that US economic competitiveness is a matter of national security. We have a range of people on this call who may not have detailed knowledge of the US trade laws and their history. And so I wondered if you could maybe kick it off by giving us a little summary of kind of where we've been and where we are today and why some of what we're seeing is so extraordinary and different than what we've seen in the past.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, first of all, to the German Marshall Fund and to Penny for convening this session and for inviting me. And interestingly, though, Penny started off by talking about social media presence and thinking sort of about contemporary actions. I very much think about the past quite a bit, which is, I suppose, why I was asked to start with this question. And it's a complicated one. And I suppose right away, my first comment is this question of is this question of economic security and is what we're seeing in real time with the policies coming out of the United States, trade policies, that new and that different. So let me reflect a little bit about the present, and then I will slowly take you back, I think, to some of my current research and thinking about how this question actually may not be so new. So ultimately, I think if we're going to begin understanding Trump 2.0 and Trump's policies, we need to think about foreign economic policy between Obama, Trump, Biden, back to Trump again. And the concerns about taking a tough position on China owing to serious labor and environmental and security risks. And there's no singular policy rationale that's here. All of these concerns tend to be interwoven. Ultimately, to understand where we are now, we can think about just from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, even though the second administration has only been going on for a couple of weeks, is to think about sort of the different rationales that may be at the center of their policies. One was seen as a very security, sort of to borrow from Jake Sullivan's language, a new Washington consensus, but also interwoven into that was a new worker-oriented policy as well that they were trying to bridge there, which involved a lot of efforts to increase US domestic competitiveness, largely through production subsidies and what they consider to be very tailored, as many as in the audience know, highly calibrated controls to sort of manage what was going in and coming out in terms of maintaining or future-proofing technological dominance, particularly in transformational sectors, but AI, biomed, tech, and stuff like that, semiconductors. Okay, ultimately though, because of the question that I was asked, sort of the key here is to find a continuity between them. One of them is that both administrations implemented tariffs largely without Congress, and this is owing to the United States laws that authorize the President of the United States to impose tariffs on imported goods without some of the institutional safeguards that are in place. So this is relevant in understanding the current Trump administration's reciprocal and fair tariff policy because it's rooted in the same rationale. So you have a series of laws, Section 232, which was the initial imposition on steel and aluminum products, tariffs for that. That's with respect to national security, but it's a very broad conception of national security that can encompass economic security, which is a new concept that we're hearing out of the Trump administration. Didn't hear economic security that much from the administration itself. Oftentimes there were concerns about supply chain security and resilience, but you did hear economic security from Japan, South Korea, and the European Commission. Okay, back to the US. So you have Section 301. This is a very, long-standing used one with respect to tariffs imposed on Chinese goods, and this allows for the president to have a discretion to address unfair trade practices. You also have the International Emergency Powers Act, the International Emergency, IEPA, now I'm forgetting the acronym, so forgive me. I was told not to use acronyms. Discretion, which allows the president to declare an emergency. The motivation of scope of that can be really unclear. It's unclear how you define an emergency. This has roots back to Trading with the Enemy Act and wanting to allow the president to have discretion. So there are no fixed time limits here when we're thinking about a national emergency. And of course, this includes threats to emergency, which is substantively broader than identifying an actual emergency at the time. Section 338, this is rarely used. This was a law that was sort of put in place even before you had the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the multilateral trading system. So this focused on discrimination of US commerce, and it's sort of capped at a certain amount that they can tariff. We've never actually seen this put into practice. If anyone wants to know more lit on that, I can always send it to you. You can just email me. And Section 122 of the tariffs, for tariffs, and that's with respect to balance of payments deficits. The key here about continuity is to understand China as a common thread here and how it may be consistent with sort of the US vision of a post-war global economy. So two things to remark of this as we start a discussion. One is whether the Chinese economic model is something that was never anticipated within the multilateral trading system. The actual system did account for different economic models. There was Czechoslovakia and Cuba as key signatories of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And you have certain provisions that did allow for the sort of addressing of central plant economies. Nothing necessarily to the extent of the Chinese production capabilities that we're seeing today, but certainly we saw different economic structures. You can also look to East Asia and the Uruguay round for Japan and South Korea. There is, however, an acknowledgement from both recent administrations that there are perceived risks and challenges with respect to China's economic growth and its approach to producing beyond demand. And this, of course, then heavily impacts the global market. So in thinking about steel, cement, these are key industries that the US has been concerned with, and we've seen tariffs placed. The other key continuity here is the budgets and trade-offs that come into play in thinking about this. How much do you address social safety nets and deal with anti-competitiveness versus sort of protecting domestic industries? Discontinuity between these administrations, this is my last point, is about the role of multilateral cooperation. So it seems far less central in the current administration's trade policies. This is not going to be, I think, too surprising to hear. One of the key things from my own research is to think about how this is a significant shift from what the United States initially designed the post-war economic system to look like in terms of law, in terms of the architecture of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That itself was a pragmatic project of economic statecraft. The design here was to form a club that were aligned in principle and in spirit, shared security to develop the global economy together. We are seeing, with all of this resistance with tariffs and the plans, and you can see it in the actions and responses from various US allies, that there is a tone deafness here into how to appreciate the implications of some of these policies that are focused on domestic competitiveness, but what their impact is on allies. And this ultimately is a challenge to thinking about what the post-World War II economic legal system was about and the governing norms and principles. So one of the key things is how to think about cooperation for state intervention that could help to develop some of these key issues. And what were the norms that were put in place when governments did have to take action? There were lots of times where the United States was focused on security and foreign policy. This is not new. I'm sure many of you know throughout the entire 20th century. There were governing norms and principles that were built into the system that sort of took into place when you could not just commit to non-discrimination. What were the norms that were there? So it's really important to focus on that history. And this is why I'm concluding by going back to that, because understanding the role that multilateralism has in that commitment to reciprocity, not in terms of bartering or a mercantilist view, but in terms of actually appreciating an equal lowering of trade restrictions amongst those allies, is a key one. But of course, one of the key questions is whether that club that is now 166 members, the WTO, World Trade Organization, whether that still works when there are principal antagonists, once there are adversaries within there. And that will dramatically change the way we think about this. So we're entering the sort of period of disorderly trade, if the previous era was seen as an orderly one, where there's an imbalance here between mutual gains and autonomy that needs to be thought through. And I'm cognizant of time, so I'll stop there. But I think the final point is that what we are seeing is sort of a collapse of both the rules and the exceptions, because by solely building out trade policies within the world of exception, all those US laws that I mentioned are exceptions to the normal practice of how Congress deals with trade. And at the same time, if there's a clear inconsistency with the United States' WTO commitments, then we're entering into a whole land of exception. And if we're in the pocket of exception, it's very difficult to get things done. I'll stop there.
Thanks. That's a super interesting point about how the exception is becoming the norm, and the norm is now becoming the exception to a certain extent. So Rupert, questions for you about, I know that you have been involved in many, many European trade activities over the years. And I know that Europe has focused on strengthening their trade defense and thinking about their trade laws in this kind of new world. And so is Europe ready for this? Because Europe, I think, is still very much an upholder of the rule of law. And I'm just curious, where and how is Europe preparing for transatlantic relations in a time of tariffs?
Thank you, Penny, and thank you also to the German Marshall Fund for inviting me for this. Well, yes, I think we are prepared in Europe. I think we have if I can call it a strategy, it has maybe 3 pillars. The first one is obviously to explain, and that links also to explaining what the transatlantic relationship is, what trade deficits are, etc., etc. The second one is to negotiate if that's an option. And the third one is also to be ready to take countermeasures too. So let me say a few words on each and all of them. And for the first one, to explain the transatlantic relationship and also the idea that there is something unfair. There might still be an audience in the US which will not look at the 160 billion euro trade deficit in goods, but will also see the fact that there is a trade surplus, a hefty trade surplus for the US in services. And money that US companies make in Europe is about 350 billion earned every year in Europe, a lot more than the 190 billion that EU companies earn in the US. So overall, this is a balanced relationship, and it's actually quite deep. There are 60 million jobs at stake. Much of the stuff that we export to the US is not to consumers, but it's to our affiliates, which have employees in the US. So there might be people who say this is maybe not such a bad thing that we are so deeply integrated. And if you start putting tariff and taxes basically on it, you might hurt your own base, you might hurt your own interests. And that is something which might not resonate with some in the present administration, but hopefully to a wider audience, even if their influence might be limited for now.Maybe that will not stay like that. So explaining the situation remains important. Secondly, of course, we are ready to address some of the real or perceived grievances. I think it's very clear that the EU is signaling if there is an issue with the unbalanced, what you call unbalanced tariffs on some product groups, take cars, for example. Numerous cases have been made that our tariff in the EU is much higher than the US. Certainly, some of these things can be addressed. In 2018, a whole negotiation took place on solving a threat from the first Trump administration on car tariffs, which led to higher sales of agriculture and LNG to Europe. So if a negotiation is to be had, and of course we all think that it's part of the Trump administration strategy to use these ideas of imposing tariffs also to get more leverage and then try to solve a problem which might not have been there, but everybody can be a winner afterwards. And thirdly, of course, there is the question, if that doesn't work, you also have to be firm. You have to signal that we're going to uphold the rule of law, and that allows us also to take countermeasures in these situations. And there's a whole array of instruments that the EU has, starting, of course, by using tariffs on their own, but also the other regulations, the anti-coercion instrument that we have passed some time ago, which allows us to react and retaliate if we have to, not only in goods, but also in services, intellectual property, and the foreign subsidy regulation, all the kinds of instruments that we have that we could possibly use. But of course, the much better outcome, because tariffs are lose-lose for everyone, a much better outcome would be to try to find a way through this and focus and also signal to the present administration that we should better focus on the real challenges in the global trading system. And that is not the EU-US relationship, but that is the way how to deal with the overcapacity and the non-state, the non-market economies, which I think we all realize are a much bigger challenge to our model of trade and investment than what is happening across the Atlantic. Thanks.
Yeah,
Penny.
so I think that's a great point, because I think it ties back to Mona's point about China and about how there's distortions in the system that maybe was never designed to take into account what some of these models look like. And as a result, thinking through what maybe there's some alternatives could be that would be more of maybe not win-wins, but a better way of dealing with it. So Dan, turning to you, maybe, and also in response a little bit to Rupert, you were the assistant USTR for Europe under Trump 1.0, and what do you see that's different this time? US and Europe had a lot of conversations. There was a deal between President Trump and President Juncker at the time that diffused some of the trade tensions between the US and Europe. But how do you see things this time, and particularly with an administration that sees tariffs as important for reshoring, rebalancing, revenue, and leverage?
Yeah, thanks, Penny, and thanks very much to German Marshall Fund for convening. I think, one of the striking things is how similar the objectives of trade policy are during this administration as they were during the first Trump administration, and also, in fact, during the Biden administration, during which I also served. The goals of trade policy are to counter perceived unfairness, to address unfair trade practices. There's a newly reinforced but older emphasis on market access. Non-market economy policies and practices like overcapacity, which Dr. Paulson mentioned, a goal of encouraging U.S. manufacturing, a persistent focus on a goods trade deficit, and we can have a whole conversation about whether that's anyone in this administration believes that can be offset by services or not, but definitely a good trade deficit is a big focus, and so those goals have remained very much the same. The other thing that's been the same has been the tool of preference for addressing these goals, which is tariffs. Now, there have been some refinements. The tariffs were used initially and maybe unprecedentedly to address issues of fentanyl and immigration when it came to Mexico and Canada. So that went beyond the normal trade or economic focus. And there's a relatively new focus on tariffs as a revenue tool. But the focus on tariffs is still there. What is interesting and also maybe different, maybe a little bit the same, is the degree to which, since there are identifiable specific goals sought to be achieved by the trade policy, and trade policy tool of preference is tariffs, that does suggest that there is room for discussing ways, arrangements, agreements that could achieve the goals, but without the tariffs, or with minimizing the tariff aspect, which is sort of Rupert's, I think, second point. And I think you see a lot of hints of this in the action so far. You had the trade policy memorandum, which did not impose the tariffs, imposed a time or suggested a timeline for looking at the tariffs, reinforced some of the objectives. There was a directive in that America First trade policy memorandum telling USTR to identify trading partners with whom a bilateral trade arrangement might be appropriate. You've had numerous suggestions from administration officials that maybe we can work out a deal. And this most recent reciprocal tariff plan that was issued does lay out a process which could start beginning in April, as soon as April, but seems to extend longer term, which of course does give opportunities for an agreement. The other thing that it was a little different, but maybe has swung back, is that initially, as Mona said, one of the justifications for putting tariffs in place was the Emergency Economic Powers Act, which doesn't have any procedures, no time frame. You just do it and it's done. Real contrast to all the previous procedures with which Dr. Paulson also mentioned, 232 investigation, which takes some time, a 301 investigation would take some time. There's a process, there's input. Interestingly, in this reciprocal tariff plan, there's a directive to USTR and Commerce to engage in investigations under their purview, which for Commerce includes 232, also includes trade defense instruments. For USTR includes Section 301 and other things. So I think you may be seeing maybe a swing from the fast and abrupt approach to imposing tariffs under emergency powers to maybe something that's a bit more deliberative, process-based, and I think which then does give opportunities for negotiating an arrangement, and you do have a very specific menu of items that you can negotiate. I think one of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at this potential shift from early in this administration to now, keeping in mind that we're only less than a month into the administration, right? Is that American transitions take a long time. I remember the first Trump administration, we didn't even have a USTR for months, and you certainly didn't have any deputies until almost the summer. I think things are moving quicker this time, but it's also true that in less than a month, we don't have a U.S. trade representative yet. We have a designate. We don't have any deputies. You have a Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary. You don't have deputies. So you don't have really the full interagency mechanism that would normally be in place to consider what to do in the event of tariffs and how to address some of what are perceived as unfair trading practices or general unfairness. So, I do see looking down the road, I do see opportunities for reaching arrangements that can minimize the impact of tariffs, minimize the fact of tariffs. I think I would stop short of repeating what I've heard in the past sometime, which is that tariffs are just a negotiating tactic. Nobody really is going to do tariffs, but it's meant to increase leverage to get an outcome. I think it's true that the hope is to achieve an outcome. And I think everybody recognizes that tariffs have some downsides. There's disagreement over how significant they are. But I don't think we should confuse that with the idea that when push comes to shove, if there are no solutions, that this administration won't put tariffs in place, because I think they will. They do like tariffs. They think it's a good tool. It's an imprecise tool. It's not the best tool, but for lack of anything else, it is the tool. And I do have some comments on the multilateral system, but Penny, I see you're anxious to move the conversation along, so I will hold those in reserve.
I mean, I think, Dan, I take your point on a lot of it. I mean, so far we've seen the threat of tariffs on Colombia. We've seen the threat of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China. China has gone into effect around fentanyl. We've seen the American First Trade Policy Executive Order, which outlines what will probably become a roadmap for where the administration goes more broadly on trade policy for the 4 years. But we've seen the 232 trade investigation on iron and steel from 2018 snap back. So now we have 25% tariffs on all iron, all steel, all aluminum coming into the United States. Even though reciprocal tariffs were in the America First Trade Policy Executive Order, they still came out with more clarifications about how they want to look at that issue, which I think have caused some consternation and some confusion. And they've now said there'll be auto tariffs on April 2nd. We can come back to this, but my question is, how can the machine handle all this? Because that's a lot of stuff that's got to go through Customs and Border Protection and others before, we're going to get to any kind of execution at the end of the day. But before we go there, I do want to take a step. Tariffs, many people say tariffs are a tax, and I know the Tax Foundation holds to that perspective. And in the American First Trade Policy, there are several places where taxes are mentioned. So while tariffs are an instrument, you can also see that the administration is lining up tax policy to also be used as a way of trying to rebalance, reshore, leverage, and to think about things, and then also revenue. And so, Sean, I just wondered if you could maybe touch a little bit on some of the tax implications of what we're seeing, and in particular, in this Reciprocal Trade Act, what do we do about the mention of VAT? Which I know I get 177 countries have a VAT scheme. So if the administration is going to call that a problem, just love your perspective on it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to GMF for hosting, and my co-panelists here. We had an event, Penny, in January, just before the Trump administration came in, and the point of that event was essentially to say out loud, tax policy is going to be a very contentious issue in the upcoming administration, and in ways that it had not been previously. Tax and trade, energy and defense, market access, these things have always been related. But tax policy at this point is a much bigger piece of the transatlantic puzzle than it has been previously. When we had this event, the three things I kind of outlined, the three variables that I outlined as being determinant of the outcome was, the first, to what extent will the US and EU work together? The second is, what does equivalency mean? And third, who decides? I think since January 16th, when we had that event till today, we've got some more clarity and less clarity on some of those key variables. The question of, I'll start first, who decides is I think the most, it sounds obvious because, well, it's the United States and whoever they're negotiating with, right? But of course, it takes two to tango. And the EU or any other country might have the best agreement on the table. And who decides? Well, ultimately, it's up to both the United States and that trading partner to actually sit down and agree. The EU can say, we'll buy the LNG all you want, and the Trump administration theoretically could just say that's not good enough, right? So who decides is kind of a big question. The second is, what is equivalency? And I guess in today's lingo, it would be, what is reciprocal? But the general point is the same, which is, if there are real and or perceived grievances from the United States about things being unfair, what would be equivalent? And in the tax space, this is particularly relevant for Pillar 2, which is the global minimum tax that was adopted by the EU and a few other countries, but notably not the United States and not China and not India. So most of the other big players in the world have not adopted the global minimum tax. What is equivalency when it comes to digital services? This was the digital services tax. There are many in Europe, and that was part of the OECD negotiations of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The basic agreement was if we adopt Pillar 1 multilaterally, then we will rescind the digital services taxes in Europe, primarily aimed at US tech companies. However, if Pillar 1 does not come through, we will maintain and potentially add to our digital services taxes in Europe. CBAM is also, it's not a tax per se. The EU will argue it's an environmental carbon border adjustment mechanism. Yes, thank you. The EU will argue it's an environmental policy. It's not a trade policy. It's not a tax. The unfortunate part is the way it's currently designed is that it's a tariff simply because it does not have export rebates, right? So we can get into how it's designed, but essentially that's another grievance you could put in the bucket of potentially legitimate. So you have Pillar 2, specifically the under-taxed profits rule, the UTPR. You have the digital services taxes, and you have the carbon border adjustment mechanism. When it comes to equivalency, there's a negotiation to be had, and I think there's potential ways of working those things out. The first question, variable that I laid out is to what extent will the US and EU work together? And frankly, I think that's where the change has, in my view, happened the most. So in my view, the multilateral system has been under strain for a while. The WTO has had issues enforcing, and specifically to some of the points previously made, there are different economic systems that the multilateral system did not necessarily account for. So the question has been for quite a while now how to enforce the trade negotiations, the trade agreements, the WTO standards, all of these things. Under the TTIP negotiations, and we have experts here who may have been intimately into those negotiations, so they can speak broader to more specifically to those. But the broad concept was the United States and Europe can work together to set some of these standards and put these things in place because the WTO is not necessarily working the way we want it to work. And as partners, as very important trading partners, security partners, if we all get on the same page, then we can go and try to get everyone else on the same page. The biggest change that I'm seeing currently is President Trump has decided, well, actually, I'm just going to serve as the WTO. I'm going to serve as the transatlantic TTIP enforcer. And maybe Europe is not a part of this equation anymore. And I think that's for me, the largest kind of theoretical change that I've seen. Personally, I think that's the wrong choice. I think we're stronger and better off as an economy in Europe, the United States, and the transatlantic relationship when we work together. But I think, bringing it back to your question on the VAT, the value added tax, is it discriminatory? Is it unfair? By adding the VAT to the mix, that's one of these kind of examples of where I can kind of see the president moving away from working with Europe and potentially just taking it on from the US perspective. Point blank, I can say very clearly, the VAT is not a tariff. It is not a subsidy for the EU exports. It is trade neutral, and this issue has been studied for 50 years. So I'm happy to send anybody Joel Slemrod's article from 1989 about how there's no impacts on this. There's all kinds of academic research showing that this is not a tariff and it's not an export subsidy. So when we're talking about kind of real negotiations, kind of what is equivalent, and the bucket of Pillar 2, the bucket of digital services taxes, the bucket of CBAM, I think there's real technical negotiations that could be had to try to solve some of the problems. When it comes to VAT, it's simply just not, there's no way to negotiate it because there's nothing wrong with it. And so I'm not really sure that there's an economic or a tax specific negotiation to be had. What it really feels like is it's more of a leverage tool to try to use in a broader negotiation. with the EU. So I'll stop there, but we have plenty of resources on our website of how the VAT works, how it's not a tariff or a subsidy, and I would encourage anyone who's confused to go read those resources.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to take a few questions that the audience has sent in, and I'm going to also weave in some questions that we have. So I think one question that we have, and I think I'll turn this over to, Dan, Rupert, Sean, I actually think you addressed this in your answer already, but Mona as well, is bilateral cooperation agreements. Is there the possibility for the US and Europe to still work together on things? I mean, Dan, you went through this the last time where there was a lot of kind of publicly stuff kind of going back and forth, and Rupert, you as well. But at the end of the day, the TTC was actually something that came out and was looked at by the Trump administration, that there was a desire to have a fora for dialogue to kind of talk about some of these issues. I'm just curious if you all could kind of maybe talk just briefly about, do you think that there is still transatlantic cooperation as a possibility? So Dan and Rupert, maybe I start with you, and then Mona, I'll bring you in.
I mean, I think yes, and I think that the America First Trade Policy Memorandum said we should look for sectoral bilateral agreements with trading partners. I mean, the history of the first Trump administration which is being repeated to a degree, is you have all this heated rhetoric, all this emotion. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, there's something that circulates in social media that has everybody's hair on fire. But underneath that whole level of rhetoric was sort of the calm ongoing negotiations. And Penny, you pointed out to some things, but during the entire first Trump administration, we did have a bilateral discussion, including on China and other issues. We then expanded it to a trilateral that included Japan, met very regularly at a ministerial level. We had an executive working group that worked on a number of bilateral issues in a very constructive and positive way. We even had a tariff elimination deal towards the end of the administration. I mean, it was very small. It was shellfish, lobster, but still, it's probably the only time in decades that we've agreed to reduce tariffs, and that happened under the first Trump administration. So I think it's easy to get caught up in the noise of the moment, which is going to happen several times a day, and will give lots of fire to lots of cocktail conversations. But then I think there is the slow and steady work. And I think it is certainly true that the Biden administration would have prioritized, say, the alliance, at least in terms of rhetoric, more than, say, the Trump administration. But actually, in actual implementation, the Biden administration did not score 100% in terms of cooperation. So I think the short answer is yes. Below all the rhetoric, I think there is plenty of space for calm, ongoing discussions, and I think the Trump administration, in their various memos, have laid out what the issues are that we can be addressing. So there's a target and an opportunity.
Rupert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I like Dan's optimism. I mean, honestly, I think it's too early to tell, given the fact that, yes, we did negotiate. Also, the TTC was created under, or at least thought through already in the first Trump administration, the Trade and Tech Council. So from an objective point of view, there are many things where we should work together and can work together and should work together. You started the whole debate with the competitiveness issue. If you see the shrinking influence of the US and the EU together in the world, I mean, working together has a lot of advantages. And whether it's on what I already mentioned on dealing with China, be it in the WTO, be it bilaterally, I think we should close, the gaps which are there and find an effective way, which we haven't found an effective way to deal with Chinese overcapacity. because sooner or later it gets into your markets. And if it's via Vietnam or Bangladesh or some other countries where the Chinese are investing now, and it's very difficult to follow all of these in real time, these overcapacity, if you wish, inflows. So on all these issues, tax, global tax, and so on, there is an objective case to be made to work together. But where the jury is still out is whether this administration is as rational as we would like it to be, even if the memos and the executive orders pertain to some of these issues. We all know that the only thing which is sure that there will be surprises, and there will be measures taken and directive coming from the White House, which will not necessarily be vetted in an interagency process that we used to know, where things were balanced out a little bit within also the US administration. We'll have to see, but that shouldn't stop us from making the case that all the challenges that we have, including economic security, which is the big issue now, need cooperation in order to be effective. And I think the jury is, or the evidence is there that dealing with China on your own by just imposing a big tariff hasn't changed the price of fish a lot. The same is true that I think if you just continue to indiscriminately impose tariffs, that will not actually get you to the kind of deals or the kind of competitiveness inclusion or manufacturing growth, whatever you're trying to pursue. So the European side is certainly reaching out and will reach out to see what can be negotiated, where cooperation is possible. But honestly, I think it's still too early to say how this will be playing out in the next couple of months.
Well, I think we've got Sefcovic in Washington this week, so we'll get an early signal, I think, coming out of his visit this week, and in terms of maybe what some of the signals are behind closed doors. Mona and Sean, there have been a couple questions come in about Congress, and that Congress is the one that's given the right to regulate trade, but in some sense they've deferred some of their authority to the president. And question is Sean, I know you guys are working on the tax bill and some of the tax stuff, and Mona, you've got the kind of institutional academic background on this, but where is Congress in all of this? And could we see them come in, Sean, via the tax bill or via other vehicles to kind of push back on some of the uncertainty that all of this discussion of tariffs and tax are creating in the business community?
Can I start? I just want to start because I had something to say about the previous question, and I'll leave Sean to answer the second one. So I want to be really clear that I agree completely with Rupert that we have considerable uncertainty, and I think that the Reciprocal and Unfair Trade Act, it is rooted in logic that can be traced back to some of the US laws that I mentioned. It's unclear how they relate or whether they will be under separate investigations, and how you sort of, if you super glue them together and create a big ball of mud, how that will work. And this stems to the fact that we've sort of have mentioned casually that, and I'm sure Dan will want to come in on this, that the multilateral trading system is ineffective. But it's also true that there are existing rules, and this is one of the key points that I think came out from Rupert's comments, that there is sort of a desire to follow the legal processes. And there are rules within the system that would allow the United States to increase its tariffs. There is a process within the WTO. They are not prohibited from increasing their tariff rate duties. There is a commitment to negotiation from that. And the question also is, in respect to imposing safeguards to protect domestic industries for a certain period of time. But it's under a process that has accountability mechanisms in place that are under a short duration. So the question is, are those programs so ineffective? Because what we've seen now is, while in the first Trump administration, we did see considerable effort to cooperate and discuss bilaterally, the question is whether all of the noise, and I agree completely that it is noise, will take away that trust and the ability to do so. I speak obviously as a Canadian and And I question that sort of watching the rhetoric and how it influences. It may not do anything. And I certainly think that key allies are going to want to negotiate with the United States. They obviously still see the United States as a key security ally. But ultimately, some of this is not going to be about trade. It's going to be about security. And this will have a huge impact in the tolerance for that. I think firms have been fairly calm on some of these changes, and it's important to not be reactive to these policies. But as far as encouraging discussion just bilaterally, one of the questions was, what about the BRICS? Well, what about Brazil? And what about India? And what about China? I think there's a presumption, and this is something Rupert said, and I'll stop here, of, does the hub and spoke still center around the United States, EU economies, or is it shifting east? And if so, then we have to think about what that role is of a sort of very aggressive opening act to have dialogue and have discussion. And you can have a discussion with other governments in a way that allows for more cooperation. And so the question would be, how do we tone down some of that noise to facilitate that? And that's very much what the WTO is. It's not toothless if you consider it to be a forum to talk. But the uncertainty is a considerable issue and has to be risked. And I'll stop there and let Sean answer the other question.
Yeah, Sean, can you enlighten us maybe a little bit on, is Congress going to come in and save the day?
I guess it depends what you mean by save in that particular sentence. So what I can say is, because the transatlantic relationship is now adding tax as a main component of tension and potentially good outcomes, good economic outcomes, good relationship outcomes. One of the key differences between trade policy and tax policy is Congress for sure has the power of the purse. I don't think there's much constitutional questions about that. And when it comes to tax policy, maybe unlike trade in some instances, when other countries are potentially taking US tax base, that's a direct, you could say, assault on the US Treasury and specifically on Congress's power within its own jurisdiction. And so that's where I think that's why, for example, the digital services taxes, but more specifically the UTPR under Pillar 2, that's really where those disagreements have come from, because UTPR, the inter-tax profits rule, allows more or less other countries to tax US companies who are operating in Europe but have, maybe the parent in the United States. If those, without getting complicated, basically another country could tax a US company on profits not necessarily made in that country, meaning Germany could tax the US company on profits not made in Germany and bring them back to Germany if they're not deemed to be paying 15% corporate income tax. And that is seen as reaching into the pockets of the US Treasury and taking it back to Germany, France, or any other country that is applying the UTPR. And so the question is, where is Congress in all of this, and how are they aligned or disaligned on the outcomes? And I would say when it comes to these tax questions, I don't know about VAT, but specifically on UTPR and digital services taxes, I think it's very clear that the Congress sees it as an assault to their power and are pretty much aligned on making sure that their power is maintained within their jurisdiction. And so Section 891 has come up as a possible retaliatory tool. There was another executive orders directing the Treasury to essentially outline any countries that are imposing any of these extraterritorial or discriminatory taxes on US companies or persons, and giving them 60 days to outline retaliatory measures that could be taken. And so maybe where it's somewhat different from trade on tax, I think it's very clear that Congress wants the power of the purse. They demand it within their own jurisdiction, and they're willing to fight in any way to get it back from other countries who may be threatening them.
Thanks for that. I mean, it's a really, I think, fascinating time because economic policy is becoming intertwined with national security. Tax is now entering also into this. And so you have a lot of stuff that's really being intertwined in kind of new and interesting ways. And it'll be interesting to see what is the stuff that most fires up people's attention in all of these interwoven issues as we move forward. Maybe as a final question to all. So there've been a couple of questions, and we've talked a little bit about China. And so some people have asked, are there areas of opportunity that the US and Europe could still work together? Some people have asked about the BRICS. And a couple of people have asked specifically about China and what do we do? And in particular also, is Europe itself aligned on some of these policies? And so, you know, is the enemy of my enemy as my friend? Does that somehow come to play into this, and that China being kind of a common external force might drive the United States and Europe to find areas of cooperation again? Or how do you see the issue of China kind of playing out? And I'm happy to kick it over to whoever, but maybe Dan, I don't know if you want to start off, or Rupert, on kind of the China BRICS questions in particular. Rupert? Oh, no,
I'm
okay.
happy to start because whoever.
Go
Okay.
ahead, Rupert.
Yeah. No, I think the question is important because, as I said, we had quite a promising discussion on steel where we invented a red box of prohibited subsidies which are not in the WTO rule book, which we were ready to apply to the overcapacity producers in steel, mainly China. That didn't work for other reasons, but not because we didn't agree this time with the Biden administration what these subsidies should actually be, which are harmful, which you can't discipline the WTO because the WTO didn't think about this kind of state-run economy. And even if you take out the green part of this negotiation, there was also a carbon discussion going on that you also give extra benefits to green steel. Even if you don't have that, there still was a good approach to see what you could do with this kind of behavior. The same is true from the pause discussion on civil aircraft. Nobody remembers that, but we also have retaliation. Yes, Dan remembers this. We still have a hefty retaliation pocketbook on both sides for Airbus and Boeing. And in that discussion, we were also saying the real threat is the new industry which comes on stream sooner or later from China. So what are we going to do about that? Because they will maybe not take our markets, but they will certainly take, with the kind of subsidies they have, the markets around the world with cheaper single or later even double A aircraft, civil aircraft. So there are these things where we should work together. And the question on the BRICS and the other countries, well, we in Europe have come to the view that since there is so much uncertainty about what happens with the US, we better shore up our alliances with the rest of the world. And this is where our free trade agreements with the rest of the world come in, the discussion with Canada and Mexico about how to react to the current uncertainty and so on. So I think there will be a kind of solidarity effect, if you wish, if some of these policies which are harmful to us will finally come on stream from the US side. So all of these things should make us think a little bit about the value of international cooperation, but in particular, dealing with the biggest challenge, which all of us know is the non-market economy behavior of China, maybe not so far down the road for Vietnam, which has also become an economic powerhouse. Thank you.
Dan, you have a comment?
Yeah, maybe I jump in quickly. I think, I mean, obviously the WTO rules, there's a huge strain on the multilateral system, both on MFN grounds, the most favored nation grounds, and on non-market economy policies and practices. And I think it really is up to some deep, detailed bilateral conversations to come up with some solutions on how you address some of these newer challenges from non-market economy policies and practices. And those kind of have to happen on a bilateral level, not just say between the United States and the EU, but with other trading partners as well. And I think one of the things that probably needs to be done to facilitate that kind of conversation is to strip off the things that end up being red lines, like are you for China or against China, or are you with us, or are you against us? Sort of strip that aspect from the discussion and really focus on the practices themselves and the policies themselves and the kind of subsidies and state enterprise operations themselves, and see if you can arrive at some disciplines that would be appropriate. And I don't think necessarily that the solution has to be something that is inconsistent with the World Trade Organization rules. It may just require some creative approaches to some of those rules. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that there was a conclusion that something like a CBAM was WTO inconsistent because it was discriminatory. But we do, if you sharpen your pencil and look very carefully and see how you can adapt the current rules to meet the current challenges, that's a positive way forward. Not to exclude the possibility that you may also at some point need new rules. But I think the first answer is not just to break the old rules. The first answer is to see how you can use the current rules to address the new challenges and strip off the kind of the third rails of, are you with us or against us? Is this anti-China, or is it, is it the West versus the rest, or is it something else?
Dan, thanks so much for that. And I'm conscious of the time. We've got 2 minutes left. So I just want to maybe close a bit, unless there's any pressing final comments. I think could go on for quite a bit, and we could spin off this conversation in many different directions. And there were a couple of questions in the chat that we didn't get time to address. And I think one of those that's quite important is around the topic of trust. And both trust within the EU in terms of the EU's ability to hold together, but also the trust between the US and Europe in how you can move forward given both some of the rhetoric, but also some of the actions, for example, on iron and steel and the 232 agreements that the administration revoked unilaterally last week. So what I take away from this conversation is that we're still in early days, but we're starting to see the picture that's emerging of some of the areas where efforts may be concentrated. We're seeing new areas introduced, particularly tax. And Sean, thanks so much for all of your explanations on that. But the tax issues, I think, remain quite an interesting new dynamic, and one that really gets at the heart of business and business clarity and uncertainty. I think that there's still quite a bit of top line versus bottom line trust. And I mean, the fact that Dan, you and Rupert are both still on this just kind of shows the level of cooperation and ties that still exist at the working level between the US and Europe. And that those have an important, but at sometimes limited role to play in the final outcomes and where things come. And I think last is that, Mona, thank you so much for bringing it. Looking forward to your paper, but where does the multilateral system go in all of this? And given the importance of rule of law to many of us, and in particular to the EU, if actions that are taken impact that might be an area that we need to look at further. So with that, thank you all for joining today. I hope that there were a few new thoughts and ideas on how to deal with tariffs and where the transatlantic relationship will be going in this time of tariffs. And I think in conclusion, I would just say, stay tuned. It seems to me this is just the beginning of what's going to be a very interesting tale that we all are involved in writing. So thank you all very much. Thank you to my co-panelists. I really appreciate you giving your time to all of us today and your wisdom and your insights. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you so much.